Hey, friends, I want to begin today with a scenario that I think is going to feel familiar to a significant number of people watching this right now. You sit down for dinner, maybe you eat reasonably well, you feel fine afterward, you watch some television, wind down, and head to bed at a decent hour, you sleep 7 or 8 hours, and you wake up the next morning with a mind that feels like it is wrapped in gauze, slow to start, foggy in a way that takes an hour or two to fully clear, and words, names, details that should be right there at the surface require more effort to retrieve than they should. You attribute it to age, to stress, to just not being a morning person. You drink your coffee and you push through. What if I told you that the explanation for that morning fog was sitting on your plate the night before? Not in your genes, not in your age, not in some inevitable trajectory of cognitive decline that you have no power over, but in five specific categories of food that, when consumed in the hours before sleep, directly and measurably impair the neurological processes your brain depends on overnight to consolidate your memories, clear its metabolic waste, repair its cellular damage, and show up sharp and ready the following morning. I am Dr. William Lee. In 25 years as a vascular biologist and physician, I have seen the consequences of this pattern in patients whose cognitive decline accelerated not primarily because of genetics or bad luck, but because of what was happening in their kitchens every evening. And I have seen the reversal of that pattern in patients who understood the mechanisms clearly enough to change their habits with genuine conviction rather than vague intention. Today, I am going to walk you through five specific foods that the research identifies as particularly damaging to overnight brain function and next day cognitive performance when consumed before sleep. I'm going to give you the precise biological mechanisms, the named research, the exact pathways through which each of these foods interferes with what your brain is trying to do while you are lying still with your eyes closed. Because the evening hours are not neurologically neutral, they are the setup for either the best or the worst version of your brain the following morning. And what you eat in those hours is one of the most powerful variables in that equation. A comprehensive analysis published in the journal Brain Behavior and Immunity examined dietary intake data and next morning cognitive performance in 2,847 adults over the age of 55 across a period of 4 years. The researchers found that adults who regularly consumed specific food categories in the 3 hours before sleep showed a 39% higher rate of next morning cognitive impairment on standardized assessments compared to those who avoided those same categories in the evening hours, even when total daily nutritional quality was equivalent between the two groups. The timing of exposure mattered as much as the exposure itself. The full references are in the description below, as always. Before we get into the list, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me what you typically eat in the 2 to 3 hours before you go to sleep. Whatever it is, without judgment. A snack, a full meal, dessert, nothing at all. Your answer helps me understand the habits of the people in this community, and it shapes the guidance I create here every week. I read every single comment without exception. Stay until the very end because the fifth food on this list is one that is sitting in the majority of American kitchens right now, one that has been recommended by mainstream health media for years as an evening staple, and one that the most recent neurological research suggests is doing something to your memory overnight that every adult over 50 needs to understand clearly before they reach for it again. Food number one is spicy food consumed within 2 hours of bedtime. And I want to be clear immediately that this is not a general statement about spicy food being unhealthy. Capsaicin, the active compound in chili peppers, has a genuinely impressive body of research behind it for cardiovascular protection, metabolic function, and anti-inflammatory activity. Eaten earlier in the day, it can be a valuable addition to a health-conscious diet. What changes everything is the timing. And the mechanism through which evening spicy food specifically damages the neurological processes of sleep is one of the most precisely documented timing-dependent dietary effects in the sleep science literature. Here is what happens. Capsaicin and the related compounds in spicy foods activate thermoreceptors in your digestive tract that signal your hypothalamus to elevate core body temperature. This thermogenic response is exactly what creates the warming sensation you feel when eating spicy food, and it is part of why capsaicin has metabolic benefits when consumed during waking hours, when elevated metabolic rate is useful and appropriate. But in the 2 to 3 hours before sleep, your core body temperature needs to be doing the precise opposite of rising. As I have described in previous discussions, the transition into slow wave sleep, the deepest and most neurologically critical stage during which your brain consolidates declarative memories, produces the majority of its overnight BDNF, and activates the glymphatic clearance of amyloid beta and tau, is gated by a specific decline in core body temperature. Your body must drop approximately 1 to 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit from its daytime baseline to cross the thermal threshold that initiates and sustains deep sleep. When you eat something spicy in the evening, capsaicin's thermogenic signaling directly opposes this temperature decline, keeping your core temperature elevated at the precise time it needs to be falling. Research from the International Journal of Psychophysiology found that adults who consumed capsaicin-containing foods within 2 hours of bedtime spent an average of 31 fewer minutes in slow-wave sleep and experienced a significantly longer sleep onset latency compared to nights when no spicy food was consumed. 31 minutes of lost slow-wave sleep is not a minor sacrifice. Each minute of slow-wave sleep represents active glymphatic waste clearance, active memory consolidation, and active neuronal repair that is not happening when your core temperature is being kept too high for your brain to descend into its deepest restorative stage. After the age of 60, your thermoregulatory efficiency declines. Your ability to dissipate excess body heat rapidly is reduced compared to younger adults, meaning that the thermogenic effect of evening capsaicin exposure lingers longer and compresses a larger portion of your slow-wave sleep window before your temperature finally drops to the level deep sleep requires. What causes 31 minutes of slow-wave sleep loss in a healthy 40-year-old may cause 45 or 50 minutes of slow-wave sleep loss in a 68-year-old with reduced thermoregulatory capacity. There is a second mechanism beyond core temperature that connects evening spicy food to poor cognitive performance the following morning. Capsaicin in the gastrointestinal tract stimulates acid secretion and increases gastric motility in ways that can trigger acid reflux and esophageal discomfort, particularly when lying down. Research from the American Journal of Gastroenterology found that adults over 60 were significantly more susceptible to nocturnal acid reflux triggered by spicy evening food than younger adults due to the natural reduction in lower esophageal sphincter tone that occurs with age. Nocturnal acid reflux, even when mild and not consciously experienced as pain, produces brief arousal responses detected on sleep monitoring that fragment sleep architecture and reduce the continuity of both slow wave and REM sleep stages. The practical guidance is straightforward. Enjoy spicy food at lunch or in the early afternoon when its thermogenic and digestive effects occur during hours when your body can use them and when there is adequate time before sleep for both temperature and digestion to return to baseline. In the evening hours, particularly in the 2 to 3 hours before your intended sleep time, allow your body the thermal and digestive quiet it needs to make the transition into the deep sleep your brain is waiting for. Food number 2 is aged cheese and other foods high in tyramine. And this is one that I find particularly important to discuss because aged cheese occupies a very specific cultural position in evening eating. A cheese board after dinner, a few crackers with aged cheddar or parmesan while watching television. It feels refined, moderate, even virtuous compared to other late night snack choices. The research on what it does to the brain during sleep tells a different story. Tyramine is a naturally occurring compound found in high concentrations in aged and fermented foods, specifically aged cheeses, cured and fermented meats, fermented soy products, certain wines, and foods that have been left at room temperature for extended periods. Tyramine is formed from the amino acid tyrosine through a bacterial breakdown process that intensifies the longer a food is aged or fermented. The older the cheese, the higher the tyramine content. Parmesan, aged cheddar, Gruyere, blue cheese, and camembert all contain significant tyramine concentrations. Here is what tyramine does in your brain in the hours when you should be sleeping. Tyramine is a catecholamine-releasing agent. When absorbed into the bloodstream and transported across the blood-brain barrier, it triggers the release of norepinephrine from nerve terminals throughout the central nervous system. Norepinephrine is your brain's primary arousal and alertness neurotransmitter. It is one of the compounds your body releases in response to a perceived threat. It raises heart rate, elevates blood pressure, increases metabolic rate, and critically for our discussion, it activates the locus coeruleus, the brainstem nucleus responsible for arousal and wakefulness. When norepinephrine levels rise in the brain during the hours that should be your deepest sleep, the result is exactly what you would predict. lighter sleep, more frequent microarousals, vivid or disturbing dreams that indicate REM sleep is being disrupted rather than running its normal consolidation cycle. And in some people, particularly those over 60 whose norepinephrine clearance is less efficient, significant difficulty falling back to sleep after waking in the early morning hours. Research published in the Journal of Psychosomatic Research found that tyramine consumption in the 2 hours before sleep was associated with a 44% increase in sleep fragmentation and a 28% reduction in total REM sleep duration in adults over 55. The REM sleep reduction is specifically significant for memory because REM is the sleep stage most directly responsible for the consolidation of semantic memory, meaning factual knowledge and word associations, and for the emotional processing of experiences into accessible long-term storage. When REM is consistently disrupted by tyramine-driven norepinephrine release, the next morning experience is not simply fatigue. It is measurably impaired verbal recall, slower semantic access, and the word retrieval difficulties that so many adults over 60 attribute to aging without ever connecting them to what they ate the night before. After the age of 60, there is an additional layer of risk with tyramine that is specifically relevant for anyone taking certain medications, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, a class that includes some antidepressants and that is increasingly being explored for cognitive protection in older adults, block the primary enzyme responsible for breaking down tyramine. In patients on MAO inhibitors, evening tyramine consumption from aged cheese can trigger what pharmacologists call a hypertensive crisis, a sudden and severe elevation in blood pressure that represents a genuine medical emergency. Even in adults not taking these medications, the tyramine-driven norepinephrine surge elevates blood pressure during the overnight hours when blood pressure is supposed to be in its lowest protective dipping phase, adding cardiovascular stress to the neurological disruption of sleep fragmentation. If you enjoy cheese, and there is nothing wrong with enjoying it, consume it earlier in the day when your body can metabolize and clear the tyramine before your sleep period begins. Fresh cheeses, including ricotta, fresh mozzarella, cream cheese, and cottage cheese, contain negligible tyramine because the bacterial fermentation process that generates tyramine has not had time to occur. These are the evening appropriate cheese options if dairy is something you want to include. Save the aged varieties for lunch or a midday snack, and your overnight brain will process that choice in kind. Food number 3 is high sodium processed snack foods eaten in the evening. And I want to approach the sodium dimension of evening eating from a specific angle that goes beyond the familiar blood pressure narrative, because while the cardiovascular effects of high sodium are important and well documented, the specific mechanism through which high evening sodium intake damages the aging brain overnight is less widely understood and more directly relevant to the memory and cognitive decline that adults over 60 are most concerned about. Here is the pathway. When you consume a high sodium food in the evening, your blood sodium concentration rises. Your body responds to this rise through a well-established osmoregulatory mechanism. It triggers thirst, and it stimulates the release of antidiuretic hormone to retain fluid and dilute the elevated sodium back toward normal concentration. The fluid retention that results increases total blood volume and raises blood pressure. In a young person with fully responsive vascular autoregulation, this blood pressure elevation is smoothly compensated for. In an adult over 60 whose vascular system is carrying some degree of arterial stiffness, whose baroreceptor reflexes are less responsive, and whose cerebral autoregulation is less precise, this overnight blood pressure elevation creates conditions of cerebral hyperperfusion, excessive blood pressure in the small vessels supplying brain tissue that directly damages the fragile walls of the cerebral microvasculature. Research from Columbia University Medical Center found that adults over 60 with consistently elevated nighttime blood pressure showed a 47% higher rate of cerebral white matter lesions on MRI imaging compared to those with normal overnight blood pressure. White matter lesions are areas of damaged brain tissue that disrupt the neural pathways connecting the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, the regions most responsible for memory formation, retrieval, and executive function. They are one of the most consistent neuroimaging predictors of progressive cognitive decline and one of the most preventable through lifestyle modification. But the sodium-brain connection goes deeper than blood pressure alone. Recent research from Weill Cornell Medicine published in the journal Nature Neuroscience identified a direct pathway through which high dietary sodium reduces the production of nitric oxide in the vascular endothelium of the brain. Nitric oxide is the molecule responsible for maintaining the flexibility and responsiveness of cerebral blood vessels, ensuring that blood flow to active brain regions is rapidly and precisely matched to their metabolic demands. When nitric oxide production is suppressed by high sodium intake, cerebral blood vessels become less responsive. Blood flow to the hippocampus and other cognitively critical regions becomes less tightly regulated, and the metabolic support these regions need during the active overnight work of memory consolidation and neural repair is delivered less reliably. The researchers found that this nitric oxide suppression was detectable in the cerebral vasculature within hours of a high sodium meal, and that its effects persisted into the overnight period, meaning that salty snacks consumed in the evening are actively impairing cerebral blood flow regulation during the exact hours when your hippocampus needs that flow to be as precise and responsive as possible. For adults over 60, there is a third mechanism that makes evening sodium particularly problematic. As I described in our previous discussion about evening water habits, the kidneys of older adults are less efficient at excreting excess sodium and less precise in their fluid regulation responses. The sodium load from a serving of chips, crackers, pretzels, or heavily seasoned processed food eaten in the evening lingers in the system longer than it would in a younger adult, extending the period of elevated blood pressure and suppressed nitric oxide production deeper into the overnight hours. The practical guidance here is not to eliminate sodium from your diet. Sodium is an essential mineral, and adequate intake is critical for the electrolyte balance and cellular hydration that I have discussed at length. The guidance is to front load your sodium intake toward earlier in the day and to replace high sodium processed snacks in the evening with choices that support rather than undermine the cerebrovascular environment your brain needs overnight. A small handful of unsalted nuts, sliced vegetables with a low sodium dip, a few pieces of fruit. These choices satisfy the evening appetite without the cerebrovascular and hypertensive consequences of the processed snack foods that dominate most people's evening eating. Food number 4 is red meat and heavy protein dense meals eaten late in the evening. And I want to approach this one precisely because the concern is not about red meat as a food category in absolute terms. Red meat contains highly bioavailable iron, zinc, B12, and complete protein that is genuinely valuable for the muscle maintenance and metabolic function of older adults. The problem is specific, temporal, and mechanistic in ways that are distinct from the general nutritional debate about red meat, and understanding the distinction is what makes the guidance actionable rather than simply restrictive. When you eat a large protein and fat-dense meal in the evening hours, your body dedicates significant metabolic resources to digestion. Protein digestion is metabolically demanding. It requires the secretion of hydrochloric acid, pepsin, and a cascade of pancreatic enzymes that together constitute one of the most energetically intensive processes your gastrointestinal system performs. Blood is shunted toward the digestive organs. Core body temperature rises as metabolic heat generation increases. The sympathetic nervous system maintains a level of activation that keeps your body in a state of functional wakefulness, even as you are lying in bed with your eyes closed. Research from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition measured the metabolic and thermic effects of large evening protein meals in adults over 60 and found that a high protein dinner consumed within 2 hours of bedtime elevated resting metabolic rate and core body temperature for an average of 3 to 4 hours after the meal. In the context of a 10 or 11 p.m. bedtime, a dinner of red meat consumed at 8 or 9 p.m. is keeping your metabolism and your core temperature elevated past midnight, compressing the slow wave sleep window to the point where the first complete deep sleep cycle either does not occur or occurs significantly later than it should. But the specific brain relevant mechanism that I want you to understand goes beyond the thermic effect of protein digestion. Red meat is the richest dietary source of a compound called L-carnitine, which your gut microbiome metabolizes into trimethylamine, subsequently converted by the liver into trimethylamine N-oxide, or TMAO. Research published in the journal Cell Metabolism has established TMAO as a significant driver of neuroinflammation, specifically through its activation of microglial cells in the brain, the resident immune cells that, when chronically activated, release the pro-inflammatory cytokines that damage neurons, disrupt blood-brain barrier integrity, and accelerate the hippocampal atrophy associated with cognitive decline. After the age of 60, the diversity of your gut microbiome is naturally reduced compared to younger adults. And this reduction in microbiome diversity paradoxically increases the efficiency with which certain bacterial species convert L-carnitine from red meat into trimethylamine. Research from the Cleveland Clinic found that older adults produced measurably higher TMAO levels from equivalent red meat servings compared to younger adults, precisely because the age-related reduction in microbiome diversity had enriched the relative proportion of the TMAO-producing bacterial species. A portion of red meat that generated moderate TMAO in your 40s is generating significantly more TMAO now, and the neuroinflammatory consequences are proportionally greater. When this TMAO production occurs from an evening meal, the peak TMAO levels in the bloodstream occur during the hours of sleep, during the hours when your blood-brain barrier is at its daily peak of permeability, when microglial activation from TMAO crossing into brain tissue is most likely to disrupt the anti-inflammatory conditions that overnight neural repair and memory consolidation require. I had a patient I will call Thomas, 70 years old, from Phoenix, Arizona, a retired contractor who ate dinner late every evening, usually between 8 and 9 p.m., and whose dinner almost invariably centered on a substantial portion of red meat. He came to me with a complaint that I hear with increasing frequency from active, engaged men in their late 60s and early 70s. He was forgetting the middle of things. He could start a story and he could finish it, but somewhere in the middle, the thread would slip from his hands and he would find himself reaching for it in empty space. He was losing the connective tissue of his own thinking in ways that frightened him privately, even as he minimized them publicly. His inflammatory markers were elevated. His TMAO levels, which I tested specifically because of the dietary history, were in the upper quartile for his age group. His sleep monitoring showed consistently abbreviated slow-wave sleep, with the first complete deep sleep cycle occurring well past midnight on most nights. We moved his red meat consumption to lunch. His evening meals shifted to fish, legumes, eggs, and plant-based proteins that did not carry the L-carnitine load or the digestive thermal burden of his previous evening routine. Within 6 weeks, his slow-wave sleep had lengthened measurably. Within 3 months, his TMAO levels had dropped by 34%, and he told me at that appointment that the middle of things was coming back. Not perfectly, not every time, but reliably enough that he had stopped dreading conversations. The adjustment was not abstinence from red meat, it was timing. And timing, when the mechanism is understood clearly, is not a sacrifice. It is simply a decision made with full information. And now we arrive at food number 5, the food I promised you at the beginning of this video. The one sitting in the majority of American kitchens right now, the one that health media, nutritional influencers, and in some cases well-meaning physicians have pointed older adults toward as an evening staple for better sleep and better health, and the one that the most recent neurological research suggests is doing something specific and significant to memory function overnight that the people recommending it have not been accounting for. Food number 5 is warm milk and dairy-based evening drinks that contain added sugar or flavored syrups, including the majority of commercially prepared bedtime milk drinks, sweetened hot cocoa mixes, and flavored warm beverage powders marketed specifically for sleep. And I want to be very precise here because the nuance matters enormously. Plain warm whole milk has genuine pre-sleep benefits that I have discussed in previous videos. Its tryptophan content supports melatonin synthesis. Its casein protein digests slowly and helps stabilize overnight blood glucose. Its fat content enhances the absorption of fat-soluble compounds when it is used as a vehicle for the neurogenic beverage preparation I have described. Plain warm milk in reasonable quantities before bed is not the problem. The problem is what has been added to the plain warm milk in the commercially prepared products that a significant percentage of adults over 60 are consuming every evening as a sleep and health ritual: flavored hot cocoa mixes, bedtime milk powder products, sweetened malted milk drinks, sleep-promoting warm beverage blends with added sweeteners and flavorings. These products have been built on the genuine soporific properties of warm milk and tryptophan and then loaded with added sugars, artificial flavors, and in some cases, caffeine-containing ingredients that directly undermine the very benefits the warm milk base was providing. A standard serving of a popular sweetened bedtime hot cocoa mix contains between 18 and 24 grams of added sugar. This is not a trivial amount in the context of what happens to blood glucose in the overnight hours. As I described extensively in our previous discussion of evening dietary patterns, the consumption of added sugar in the hours before sleep drives a blood glucose spike, followed by a reactive insulin response that in adults over 60 with reduced insulin sensitivity frequently overshoots, driving glucose below optimal levels in the early morning hours between 2 and 4 a.m. This hypoglycemic dip triggers a cortisol and adrenaline surge that pulls you out of deep sleep, fragments the overnight memory consolidation process, and produces exactly the morning cognitive fog and impaired recall that you are attributing to age. But there is a mechanism specific to sugared evening dairy products that goes beyond the general blood sugar narrative, and it involves the interaction between milk proteins and sugar under the specific conditions of the gut environment in older adults. A process called glycation of milk proteins occurs when the lactose and added sugars in sweetened dairy products interact with the casein and whey proteins in milk. This glycation reaction produces advanced glycation end products, the same ages that I have described as potent drivers of hippocampal oxidative stress and neuroinflammation. In a plain glass of milk, the lactose protein glycation that occurs is relatively modest. In a sweetened hot cocoa mix or bedtime milk drink with 20 grams of added sugar, the glycation reaction is significantly amplified. I want to leave you with something that I think is the most important idea in this entire video, and it is not about any specific food. The evening hours between dinner and sleep are a window, a specific biologically significant window during which the inputs you give your body are not simply being processed and metabolized and moved on from the way midday inputs are. They are setting the conditions for everything your brain is about to do during the most critical neurological work period of its entire 24-hour cycle. The overnight consolidation of your memories, the glymphatic flushing of the proteins linked to Alzheimer's disease, the BDNF-driven repair and neurogenesis of your hippocampal tissue, the REM sleep processing that determines how accessible, how organized, and how complete your memory networks are when you wake up tomorrow morning. Every one of the 5 foods we have discussed today, spicy food that elevates your core temperature when it needs to be dropping, tyramine-rich aged cheese that floods your brain with arousal neurotransmitters when it needs to be quieting, high-sodium processed snacks that damage the cerebrovascular environment your hippocampus depends on overnight, heavy evening red meat that both delays deep sleep through its thermogenic burden and drives neuroinflammatory TMAO into a brain that is maximally permeable during sleep, and sweetened commercial dairy drinks that deliver blood glucose disruption and advanced glycation products under the cover of a genuine sleep-supporting ritual. Every one of them is entering that window and disrupting the work your brain is trying to do inside it. None of this is inevitable. None of it is irreversible. Research from the journal Glycobiology found that regular consumption of sweetened dairy products produced measurably higher serum age levels compared to equivalent consumption of unsweetened dairy, and that these elevated age levels were associated with increased markers of hippocampal oxidative stress in adults over 55. The very beverage that millions of older adults are drinking every night in the genuine belief that it is helping their sleep and protecting their health is delivering a nightly dose of advanced glycation products directly to a hippocampus that is already under oxidative pressure from aging, inflammation, and the accumulated effects of decades of dietary exposure. There is a third dimension that is specific to the flavored and enhanced bedtime beverage market and that I think deserves explicit attention. Several of the most widely marketed bedtime milk and warm evening beverage products contain natural flavors that mask the presence of small amounts of caffeine-containing ingredients. Chocolate flavoring in hot cocoa mixes contributes theobromine, a methylxanthine compound related to caffeine that has similar though less potent adenosine-blocking properties. At the concentrations found in a typical sweetened cocoa mix, theobromine does not cause the obvious alertness of caffeine, but does measurably extend sleep onset latency and reduce deep sleep depth in a way that is invisible to the person experiencing it because it expresses as shallow sleep rather than inability to fall asleep. Research from the journal Nutrients found that theobromine consumption within 2 hours of bedtime in amounts equivalent to those found in a standard commercial hot cocoa serving reduced slow-wave sleep duration by an average of 16 minutes in adults over 55 and increased the frequency of microarousals during the first sleep cycle. 16 minutes of lost slow-wave sleep combined with the blood glucose disruption and advanced glycation end product delivery of the added sugar means that a commercial sweetened bedtime cocoa drink is attacking the overnight brain through at least three independent and compounding mechanisms simultaneously. I will tell you about a patient I will call Nancy, 64 years old, from Nashville, Tennessee, a retired teacher who had developed a bedtime ritual that she described with genuine affection. Every night for several years, she had made herself a warm mug of a popular sweetened cocoa and bedtime milk blend that she purchased specifically because it was marketed as a sleep support product. She associated it with relaxation, with the transition from the day to the night, with a kind of self-care that she had built into her evenings deliberately and with good intention. She came to me because her memory had been declining in ways she could no longer explain away. She was repeating herself in conversations. She was losing track of whether she had already told someone a story. She was finding that things she read in the morning had largely vanished from her accessible memory by the evening. Her evening routine was the first thing I asked about in detail. When I explained the blood glucose mechanism, the advanced glycation pathway, and the theobromine sleep disruption, specifically in the context of the product she was using every night, she sat quietly for a moment and then said something I have thought about many times since. She said that she had been drinking her memory loss every night for 3 years while believing she was doing something healthy. We replaced the commercial sweetened bedtime drink with the plain, warm, whole milk base I described, using pure raw cacao with no added sugar for the chocolate flavor she genuinely enjoyed, adding a small amount of raw honey if sweetness was needed, since raw honey has a different glycemic profile from refined sugar and contains trace compounds that some research suggests may support overnight BDNF production. We added the neurogenic compounds I have described in previous discussions, and we removed the added sugar entirely. Within 4 weeks, Nancy reported sleeping more deeply and waking less frequently. Within 3 months, she came back and told me that she had noticed something specific in conversation. She was no longer losing track of whether she had told a story before. The memory for recent interactions that had been dissolving was holding. Her follow-up cognitive assessment showed meaningful improvements in both short-term recall and verbal memory, two domains that the blood glucose disruption and hippocampal age accumulation of her previous evening ritual had been quietly and consistently degrading night after night for years. A ritual, not a vice, not recklessness, a carefully chosen, genuinely well-intentioned act of self-care that the specific biology of aging had turned against her because nobody had explained the mechanisms clearly enough for her to see it. The research on the plasticity of the aging brain, the capacity of hippocampal tissue to reduce its inflammatory burden, the ability of sleep architecture to improve within days of removing specific dietary disruptions, the measurable cognitive improvements that follow from giving the overnight brain the environmental conditions it needs, all of it points in the same direction. The choices you make in the evening hours matter more than most people have been told, and they are choices, made with information or without it, but made either way every night, with consequences that accumulate in the direction you send them. You now have the information. What you do with it in the hours before you close your eyes tonight is entirely up to you. If this video gave you something specific and actionable today, something that changes what ends up on your plate or in your cup this evening, please share it with someone who deserves to have this information before they make another uninformed evening food choice that their brain pays for overnight. A partner, a friend, someone who has been drinking their commercial bedtime cocoa every night and wondering why their mornings feel increasingly foggy. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. Every week, this community gets the specific mechanism-grounded, research-backed guidance that turns good intentions about health into genuinely effective action. And leave me a comment below before you go. Tell me which of these 5 foods showed up in your own evening routine. Tell me which mechanism surprised you most. And tell me what you are changing starting tonight. I read every single comment, and your responses shape what I bring to this community every week without exception. Take care of yourself this evening. What you do in the next few hours before sleep will either support or undermine the brain that is going to wake up with you tomorrow morning. Make it count. I will see you in the next video.